Hi everyone! So today I'm going to be showing you how to acclimate imported plants from start to finish. So about a month ago I did receive an order of plants from AroidAsia in Indonesia. I'm going to be using those plants as an example to show you today. I have been documenting their journey through acclimation from day one all the way through to today so that you can see kind of what to expect when acclimating imported plants. Now, the first thing I want to mention up front is most imported plants are probably going to be coming to you bare root. So basically the roots are probably going to be wrapped in some sort of like tissue paper or paper towel or something that has been dampened so the roots don't dry out. Some of you may, however, actually be living in a country where you can receive imports in, say, for example, sphagnum moss or cocoa coir or cocoa chips or something like that. My plants have come to me bare root, so I am going to focus on that first, but I will touch here in a bit on the things that you might need to do differently if it's coming to you in some sort of substrate. But regardless of whether your plants are coming bare root or in some type of substrate, there are two things that I want you to do first as soon as you have unboxed those plants. Number one, check that plant for pests. You should not be seeing pests. Most reputable sellers are going to have a photosanitary certificate saying that their plants are basically clean and pest-free. So the odds of you finding pests should be relatively small. If you do, however, find pests, definitely document it and notify the seller immediately. And while I'm talking about documenting things, if that box comes to you and it is damaged in any form or fashion, take thorough pictures of the box before you open it, because if damage to the box is the reason that you discover dead plants inside, you need to have that documentation prior to opening the box to show the seller so that hopefully you can get reimbursed or new plants sent to you. Now, once you have checked the leaves and everything for pests, I want you to gently unwrap the roots and check the roots and see how they're looking. I specifically want you to look for root rot. It is not uncommon, you guys, to have some root rot on imported plants. Where you would be highly concerned is if we're talking like more than 50% of the roots are rotted. In that situation, you would definitely once again want to document that thoroughly and let the seller know. But mostly what you're going to discover is just a few roots rotted here and there. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to remove that rot using a clean, sterile pair of snips, scissors, a knife, whatever you may have. Get any signs of rot off of there. Now, you can at this point, if you want to be super extra cautious that you've gotten it all, or maybe if they're very fine roots and there's a lot of them and you're not sure if you got it all off, you can treat those roots with a little rinse down in a solution of 1 part hydrogen peroxide and 2 parts water to help to kill off anything that might still be lingering on those roots. Now, if we are dealing with bare root plants, I don't care what kind of plant it is that you have received, once you have checked those roots, removed any rot, done that treatment if you choose to do so, you are going to put that plant into a vessel of water. Roots typically have dried out some, no matter how well they were packaged. On the way here, they will have gotten slightly dried out. Sometimes you will find that they are severely dried out. You can tell sometimes just before you unwrap the roots if it's going to be dried out just based on how turgid and stiff the leaves on that plant are. But it is important to get the plants rehydrated as quickly as possible. So you're going to put those plants into some vessels of water, and then you're going to want to leave them there for at least 24 hours, at least 1 full day. Now, once again, you'll be able to tell looking at the roots and looking at the leaves of the plants if some of the plants are a little bit more dried out than others. In that case, I would probably leave them in the water for a little bit longer. Definitely leave them in the water until the leaves start to plump back up. So for example, this philodendron splendid that I received in that package from AroidAsia, the leaves, as you can tell in this photo from the day that it arrived, were a bit floppy, a bit droopy. And of course, I immediately put it into a vessel of water. And the next day, you can see here that the leaves have perked back up. They're not as droopy anymore. The plant is getting rehydrated. But because that plant was looking a bit more droopy and the roots were a bit more dry than the other plants when I received it, I decided to leave that one in water for a whole extra day versus some of the other plants that I received. Now, there is a possibility when you open a package that you may have 1 or 2 plants that just are really bad off. You may even find you have dead plants. If you do find you have dead plants, once again, document it, let the seller know. If you have a plant that's really bad off, but seems like maybe it's still alive, still document it so that you can let the seller know, especially if it doesn't make it. but immediately get that plant into water. That is what happened with this Libicea that I received in that order. It was crunchy, so dehydrated, and it did have roots on it that it has very fine roots, so it's kind of hard to tell if they were super dried out or not. But I did think that it was relatively viable, and regardless of whether I thought it was viable or not, I was going to give it a go. So I immediately popped it into water, and I did leave that one in water longer as well because it was so dehydrated. Now, after the plant has been in water for a full day or however long is necessary to get it to perk back up, you want to go ahead and get that plant potted back up into some sort of medium, whether it be sphagnum moss or just the soil that it's gonna live in permanently. And honestly, you guys, I prefer to take them straight into the type of soil that I'm gonna have them in permanently, just because going to moss may be easier on the plant initially, but then you're gonna have to go through another like second acclimation phase when you move it out of that moss into soil. So that is why I prefer just to take it straight to soil. But if you are more experienced with moss and you feel more comfortable with sphagnum moss, you can do that as well. But once you get the plant potted up, one of the most important things to do is to keep the plant in a warm, humid environment. Most of these imports are coming to us from very humid places, and they are going to be shocked by probably the low humidity in your house. Now, I did get lucky the week that I received these plants. The average humidity in my house was 60%. And depending on the type of plant, you guys, if you have an average humidity in your house like I did that week of 60% or higher, your plants may not need to be put into some kind of special humid environment, such as a greenhouse cabinet, a greenhouse tent, a plastic box, or something else that allows you to trap in humidity around that plant. So in my case, I also knew that some of the plants I received are more tolerant of lower humidity than others. So a few of them I chose to leave outside of my IKEA greenhouse cabinet when I received them because the humidity was the level that it was in my house, but the rest of them I knew needed to go into that cabinet. Now, if you do not have a greenhouse cabinet, a greenhouse tent, anything of the sort, do not panic. There are several things you can do. So once again, I just mentioned like you could put it in a clear plastic box. So if you have a Tupperware type box that is big enough for the plant to fit in, you can close it in that box, make sure it is a clear box so it can still get light, and that will help trap the moisture in. Now, if you are doing that, I highly recommend that you vent that box a couple times a day, because if you have too much moisture in there, you can develop mold and other things that can be harmful to your plant. Another thing you can do is just use plastic bags, wrap them around the plant. That will help to trap in moisture as well. But for most of these plants, you're gonna want at least 60% humidity. For the more humidity loving plants, you're gonna wanna try to go about 75% or higher in terms of the level of humidity while they're acclimating. Now, it is also important to keep them in a warm environment because they are also typically coming from places that have very mild temperatures. They don't really get super cold. They're places that don't get super hot as well. So definitely make sure you're keeping those plants warm. Make sure you're giving them ample light, but you don't want to take them into too bright of light right away because it could cause some shock to the plant, especially when it's been in a box with no light for who knows how long, traveling its way to you. Now, if you do have your plants in a greenhouse cabinet like mine, I have grow lights in there. The ones that I have are super gentle enough for the plants. They weren't at risk of getting any kind of like burn or anything like that. I do have those linked in my Amazon store, and there is a link to that storefront in the description below for you if you're interested in checking out those lights. Now, the plants that I did not put directly into the cabinet, such as this Monstera Thai constellation, I just gradually over the first few weeks moved it closer and closer to a brighter window where it was getting kind of indirect light, a little bit of direct light maybe for a few minutes of the day, and I just kept an eye on it. As long as I didn't see anything bad happening, I left it there. If I had seen any kind of paling of the leaves or burning or anything like that, I would have pulled it further back from that light source. But let's talk real quick about some of the things that you might experience, even if you're doing everything right, with your imported plants over that first week or two that you have them. And one of the most important things for you to remember is that if these things I'm about to describe happen to you, do not panic. Do not go into panic mode and make crazy decisions like taking the plant out of its pot, looking at its roots again. These are just things that can naturally happen. They do not necessarily signify that there is something going wrong with the plant. So let's take a look at my plants that I got and what I experienced with each one over the course of the first 2 weeks. So arguably, you guys, the most hardy and easiest to acclimate plants out of all the ones I got was this Monstera Thai constellation. This Thai constellation didn't skip a beat. I didn't have to put it in my cabinet. Even when the humidity level in my house a few weeks after I got the plants dropped because it did get colder outside here, and we went from averaging 60% humidity to around like high 30%, I did keep a close eye on the Monstera when that happened. It was fine. It was fine. It was perfectly fine. If I had seen it looking like it wasn't fine, I would have tried to fit it in the IKEA cabinet. Honestly, you guys, it's too tall. But I would have figured out something. I would have covered it with a plastic bag or something of the sort. But it did not miss a beat. As you can see here, we didn't lose a single leaf. We actually had a new leaf coming in when I got it, and it had started to unfurl almost completely by the time we hit that 2-week mark. That is what we like to see, because then as a plant parent, we aren't panicking and we feel like we are good. We've got this acclimating imported plants thing down. But once again, Monsteras are pretty hardy when it comes to being shipped and acclimating and recovering from that whole shipping process. So let's take a look at the Monstera adansonii that I got next, because things were not quite so straightforward with this plant. Now, when I did receive this plant, it did have quite a few yellow leaves. All but 2 of its leaves were yellow, and the other 2 were kind of yellow. So I already knew up front that I was going to lose some leaves. So after I had put this plant in water, when I went to move it to soil, I did have a leaf just fall off then. Not unexpected, like I said, it was already yellow. Then over the course of the first 2 weeks, the other yellow leaves started to die off kind of one by one, but once again, they were already yellow. The good news is that the 2 leaves that were only slightly yellow, the most green ones, actually started to get a little bit more green. That is a good sign to me that the plant was recovering well. They also went from kind of pointing downwards in the beginning, as you can see here, to then pointing upwards towards that light. That's a good sign that that plant is recovering and it's doing fine, and there was no reason for me to panic over the fact that it was dropping leaves. Now, that philodendron splendid that I talked about earlier that had the very kind of dry roots when I got it, and you saw that the leaves were a bit droopy. Once again, I did leave it in water for an extra 24 hours. And then I potted it up, and I took a bit of a gamble on this one, you guys. This is a plant where I was kind of like 50-50 on whether it would be okay with the 60% humidity in my house versus needing to be in the IKEA cabinet, where we were at around like between 75 and 80% that week in the cabinet. Honestly, it's a little bit big to fit in the cabinet, and I did want to go ahead and give it a pull when I potted it up. So I took a gamble and I decided not to put it in the IKEA cabinet. And as you can see here, it was fine. It also, like the Monstera, did not skip a beat over the first 2 weeks. Its new leaf did not actually do anything in terms of getting bigger or unfurling over those 2 weeks, but I did not see any kind of decline in the plant, and that's what I was looking for to signify to me that I might need to move it into the cabinet. Now, next up, we have my Anthurium silver blush that I received. I knew this one was going to be more sensitive to the humidity than the first 2 plants we just looked at, so I immediately put this into the IKEA cabinet. Now, knowing what I've heard from other people about Anthuriums that they've received imported, I was fully anticipating losing at least 1 leaf during the first 2 weeks. However, as you can see, I did not. That 1 leaf is drooping. It is slightly yellow. It seemed to be yellowing kind of maybe gradually, but it was really honestly kind of hard to tell, you guys. So I was thinking this whole time that eventually that leaf was going to fall off in the first 2 weeks, but it didn't. So the fact that I did not have any kind of negative anything happen in those first 2 weeks definitely was a good sign that things were going well. But let's talk about when things don't go well, because right now you guys are probably like, well, what's a sign that something's not going well? Well, the sign that something's not going well, I think the Hoya I received is going to be the best example for you guys. So this plant, once again, rather large plant. So I took a gamble after having it in water, and when I potted it up, I decided to try to just leave it out in my house in the 60% humidity. I cannot state for sure if the humidity is why what happened or not. But when I saw what was happening happen, I did eventually move it into the IKEA cabinet. So one of the leaves was slightly damaged, one of the top leaves. There are 2 vines on this plant when I received it. Top leaf was slightly damaged, and that leaf started very quickly over the course of the first week to kind of dry up and shrivel from the tip to the top, and eventually I had to remove it. However, after that, the top leaf on the second vine started to do the exact same thing, and then it fell off on its own one night. And that's when I decided perhaps I needed to move this plant into the IKEA cabinet to see if maybe this was a humidity related issue. Now, I did this at about the 1.5 week point. So as you can see here, we can't really tell for sure if anything else was happening at the 2 week point, but this is what I would recommend you do if you experience something like this at the 2 week mark. Once again, I don't want you to panic and do all kinds of other crazy things to the plant. So just solve the one problem you think it might be at a time. Then wait some more days, another week, see what happens. If it is still getting worse, address it from that point forward. But let's talk about those plants like my Lobesia that was really bad off when I unpackaged it. For those plants, what you are looking for over the first 2 weeks is signs of life. That is basically all you're looking for. If you see decline, we already knew the plant was bad off. We knew it might be dead. You know, it's already in a bad state. So you may lose some more leaves, things like that might happen, but what you want to look for is signs of life. So for example, on this Lobesia, I did notice a little while after I potted it up that there was the start of the tiniest little baby leaf at the very base of the plant by the soil. That is definitely what you want to see, is some sign of life in one of the plants that may come in looking that bad off. You want to see some signs of life like that by the 2-week mark. Now, what about after the 2-week mark? Usually, if you make it to the 2-week mark and everybody is doing relatively well, that is a good sign that everybody is going to make it. You still want to keep everybody in kind of that type of environment you've got them in where they are happy and doing well until you actually start to see signs of new growth. Once you see signs of new growth, that is your indicator that the roots have acclimated and started to be able to function normally to push out new growth. The rest of the plant is acclimated and is willing to grow. It has recovered, it is well rested, and now it can put its energy into growing and becoming even more beautiful than it already is. When you start to see that new growth, that is when you can start trying to remove the plant from that special extra humid environment that you have it in and into the place where you want it to actually live in your house. Now, depending on how sensitive the particular plant is to humidity, what I would do is I would be taking those plants out of the cabinet for part of the day only, then putting them back in there. I don't want them to just be taken from 80% humidity down to 40 or 50 in my house and just immediately just leave them there. They could go into shock. So just gradually move them in and out of those humid environments. Take them out for longer and longer each day. If you see that they aren't responding well to it, keep them in the humid environment for longer during the day and just gradually work your way through it over time until they are able to happily live outside of that extra humidity that you initially had them in. But just because everything is going good at the 2-week mark does not mean that things cannot still go wrong during weeks 3 and 4, and that is what happened with the Anthurium silver blush. So if you notice that a plant is not putting out new growth like this plant, and you start to notice other weird things, for example, this plant's leaves were not as rigid and turgid as I would like them to be, that's a good sign that something might be going on with the roots. So this was definitely cause for concern for me because that is the plant where I had to remove more rot off of the roots than any of the other plants I received, and the root structure got quite a bit smaller in the process. Now, it was not like 50% of it or more that I was having to cut off, but the root structure was not huge on that plant to begin with when I received it. And because of that, I fully anticipated that that one might struggle a little bit more or take a little bit longer to get acclimated because it needed to start developing more roots again. So in this situation, I would definitely recommend taking the plant out of the pot and checking its roots. And when I did that, I did discover that pretty much all of the roots had rotted off on this Anthurium. If that happens, your best bet is to remove as much of the rot as possible, give it a rinse off in the mixture of 2 parts water, 1 part hydrogen peroxide, and restart the plant in water, basically like a water propagation. And over the course of weeks 3 and 4, the Lobesia still did not fully recover. On day 27, I did check the roots. They do look fine to me. I did take it down to a slightly smaller pot size just in case, but only time will tell with this one. Now, the issue with the Hoya was pretty much resolved by putting the plant into the IKEA cabinet. We did lose 1 additional leaf immediately after putting it into the IKEA cabinet. It was one of the lowest leaves, but since then it has done fine. I did wait until day 28 to start taking this plant in and out of the cabinet to acclimate it to the regular humidity in my house, just because it did have that leaf loss issue early on. I don't expect to see new growth on this plant right away because it is a Hoya and it's going to put more energy into developing its root system before it starts to grow again, but all in all, we're looking great. The Monstera Thai constellation still continued to do just fine outside of the IKEA cabinet during weeks 3 and 4, and as you can see, its new leaf did fully unfurl and is looking beautiful. The Philodendron Splendid also continued to do fine during weeks 3 and 4. It did get a brand new leaf in and actually has a second new leaf starting to come in as well. And the Monstera adnesonii also continued to do well. I did start taking this plant in and out of the cabinet to acclimate it to my house humidity at the start of week 4, and as you can see, we didn't even lose that last yellow leaf yet, and we have now officially gotten our first new leaf. So all in all, pretty good for an order of bare root imported plants. But let's talk real quick about the few key differences in what you're going to need to do if you are receiving plants that are in some type of substrate, such as sphagnum moss or cocoa coir or cocoa chips. So if you are receiving plants that are not bare root and they are in a substrate like that, you're gonna wanna check the wetness level of the substrate when you unbox those plants first. If it is excessively dry, you're going to want to water that plant immediately. However, I do not want you to top water it down because you don't know exactly how dry those roots have gotten, and you're running a risk of like a dry rot type situation if you do that. I want you to set the plant into a vessel, fill the vessel with water, let that plant suck up what it needs to suck up until the top of that soil starts to feel moist. But once the top of that soil is damp, you are going to do the exact same thing that you did after you had potted up the bare root plants. So follow that exact same procedure once this plant has been rehydrated. Now let's say that you unbox the plants and that substrate is very, very wet. First of all, obviously you are not going to want to water the plant in that situation. However, I don't recommend you go trying to dry it out either, like with paper towels or anything like that. I've seen some people try to do that before, but sometimes that can end up compacting the soil down in those roots, and that can cause problems in and of itself. So if it is excessively wet, you want to try to encourage it to get less wet, not completely dried out, but dry it out more in a natural way. And the best way to do that is to put it in a warm environment with a decent amount of light. Now, also, once again, we have this issue of we need to put it in a humid situation, and sometimes that will keep the soil moist longer. But you know, sometimes you're just gonna have to do what you have to do in that situation. So the best advice I have for you, warm place with enough light, and then just don't touch it until it is dried out enough to warrant watering again. Now, what we are hoping to see if you are receiving plants in a substrate is that that substrate is damp, but it's not too wet and it's not too dry. And in that situation, you're going to treat it just as you would those bare root plants once you have potted them up. If you want to try leaving it in the humidity level in your house, like I did with my Monstera, if it's a plant that you think can tolerate that and the humidity level in your house is high enough, then you'll just put it into a slightly indirect bright light location. If it does need higher humidity, you will either put it into a greenhouse cabinet or wrap it in some bags or any of the other things that we talked about. And then you will just treat it normally. Once the soil gets dry enough to warrant watering, then you will water it. But that is the primary difference between receiving bare root plants versus plants in some type of substrate. But that is the acclimation process that I take my imported plants through. And once again, you guys, the worst thing you can do is panic. If something does look like it's going wrong, just take a deep breath, assess what might be causing it, and remember that it might just be something that is going to happen because of the stress that the plant went through when it was traveling in the mail to you. But I hope you guys have found this video helpful today. If so, please be sure to click that like and or subscribe button down below. And if you've not yet seen my unboxing video where I unboxed all of those beautiful plants I got from AroidAsia, you can check that video out next, right here. Thanks for joining me today, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!